Welcome, everyone. This is Orlando Stoics on Friday night. Again, we are continuing our series of Stoic practice, and the book tonight is How to Think Like a Roman Emperor by Donald Robertson. We are halfway through chapter 3. We're going to do the second half of that chapter, which is about Marcus Aurelius. And some of the sources today, besides that book, are also Psychology Today and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. These are all my trusted sources, and I go to them often to make sure not only that we get the history and the names and the dates right, but also, sometimes you have to read things from different angles to get the true meaning out of it or to get the interpretation correct. So let's start with the chapter itself is, as I said, it's chapter 3, and we're going to start. Joe, we're going to talk about Marcus Aurelius and how he showed his gratitude in book 1 of the Meditations, the famous book. I know that's one of your favorite books.
Oh, it absolutely is, because he highlights the best in each individual and, shows how they have formed him. And in a way, he's actually setting the stage to kind of create the ideal sage. He is outlining what he likes most about it, or what he's taken from each individual. And then from there, he starts to try to implement that into his daily life. And that's what I really love about this particular chapter, is that it's really about creating the sage on the shoulder and the ideal and how we can actually model that.
Good point. I remember the first time I read book 1, it was like a list of names to me. And it was interesting because you could see the people in his life. But when you go back and read it maybe a second time, you see that he's giving credit to each person for what he learned from them. Things like kinship and discipline and kindness, very simple things that we still value today.
Absolutely. And I mean, and those are the things that are the most important. And that what it really highlights Marcus's appreciation for virtue and shows you what he really valued as an emperor. And I think that this is important because it's also how he conducted himself. So this is also how he ruled. And I find book 1, it's my favorite in the sense that he finds the best in everyone, but it's also the most important as far as modeling and coming up with as I'd mentioned, the ideal.
Now today, I always like to bring things forward into the modern day. And if we think about who Marcus looked up to, these different characters, his friends, his family, even Antoninus, the emperor who was before him, that was his adopted father or his adoptive father. And he looked back on the kindness and the reason that he used. But think about, what can we use today? In the modern day, we have a lot of possibilities, not just great figures, great thinkers, whatever, but we can even look into pop culture. I have people who have, over the years, told me they look to very famous movies like The Shawshank Redemption, the Stoic qualities in that, and how you can be persistent in your life and get results that way. You can even have a comedy like Groundhog Day, that you see a character, Bill Murray, and he's searching for meaning in his life. These can be great examples today.
There's always some truth in comedy and pop culture that I think we can model. And we can say that it just in that particular context, that it strikes us a certain way and actually invokes a certain emotion in a healthy manner that allows us starts to have us think, and can be a catalyst for a certain amount of change in our life. Absolutely. And I think, that's interesting because you mentioned 2 movies that are really stoic in nature.
Mm-hmm. Now let's move on to the sage and what Marcus looks for in the sage. Donald Robertson describes the sage as someone who is always keeping to justice, who is accepting fate, caring for others, things like that. And Donald really did his research well, and the way he briefly encapsulates that, because in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it has a similar definition. The sage is always seeking virtue, of course. Nothing else makes the sage happy. The sage is also indifferent to fate and never assents to impressions. You know, and that was very like 100% stoic, right on the money there. These are things that are hard to live up to, of course.
And I think the most important part is that, you start to have somebody that you can look up to. You're coming up and you're saying, this is a virtuous individual, and this is the person that I want to look up to. And then you start to have a value system, to develop a value system where you can then manage your life. And at the same time, it really makes you call out what you do value. And I think that that's critically important, because a lot of times people will say they maybe admire this about somebody or admire that about somebody, and they don't necessarily know what they value, though. What are their goals? And that's one of the most important parts of the chapter that Donald really calls out, how to have meaningful goals and how that relates directly to our virtue, and how that then is in turn leads to happiness and what we determine to be a good life.
Mm-hmm. Now, we can also translate some of these ideas about modeling. Well, we've already used the term modeling. It is very much talked about in psychology today. For those of you who are not just interested about Stoicism, but also the scientific side of things in psychology, modeling is something they refer to a lot, and it's about copying behaviors and also just the attitudes of people, even aside from the actions. Just your attitude about in certain situations can be helpful. And in psychology today, I know Donald mentioned this in the book. He says there's a phrase that you can use: what would Marcus say in this situation? What would Marcus say? And my friend Tim in Minnesota has another version of this that he enjoys, which is, what would Marcus do? Now, either of these things, if you employ this in your life, it's a good bit of psychology. It's a very simple way of practicing to be a Stoic, to be a better person. And I don't know, have you heard other versions of those things, Joe?
Those versions are the ones that I'm most familiar with. But I think that the really important point here is that you start to see incremental changes, and Donald kind of highlights that when you're practicing this and you start to think about maybe complaining about something that you would normally complain about, you could start to think about, what would Marcus do? What would somebody else do? The ideal do? And the minute you start to invoke that, it prevents you from going to a place that you really shouldn't. And I think that that's really the most important part about this. And it makes you derive huge benefits from this exercise, because it really does allow you to continually question what desire. You're not going to act on your desires or your instincts as quickly, because if you start to question them, you're saying, well, what would so-and-so do in this situation? What would Marcus do in this situation? You're not going to act as impulsively. So you're also thinking mindfully. And this gets into Stoic mindfulness.
Yeah. And, to add to that, this is something that's not in the book, is your approaches to things like this modeling. I read another article in Psychology Today that talks about how modeling can be passed on to your kids when you're teaching them. This is aside from Stoicism. This is just teaching kids good behavior. When they have an emotional response to something that happens, instead of you becoming upset with them or throwing more emotion back on them, they said in Psychology Today that you can help them resolve the problem, whatever they got emotional about in the first place. And this, I thought, was a very Stoic response, to show a kid, hey, here's a problem, let's work on it, let's break it into pieces, let's solve it.
Absolutely. And I think that, it made me a much healthier teenager if I had that role model. Not to say that my parents did an excellent job, but that if you had this logical approach to a problem, as opposed to letting your emotions dictate how you're going to react. And on top of that, if it would be really been really helpful for me to have a routine down at an early age as well. And we talked a little, this chapter talks a little bit about the idea of the learning cycle, and we'll come to that in a minute, but how important it is to really have a process on how to use the ideal, the role model, the sage on the shoulder. It's not just identifying them, and then you identify your values, but how are you going to then implement that on a daily basis? And Donald really gives you a fantastic way of actually doing it in a practical manner, and in only a few pages. It's quite remarkable.
Right. And that brings us to the next thing, when Donald recommends in chapter 3 that we have morning and evening meditations. This is your way of training yourself so that you can better meet these whatever events that may happen. And I really like the way he states it simply, but I link it to a lot of things, a lot of practices that I've heard over the years, like some people who appreciate Seneca. Seneca had this great line about balancing your books every evening.
Right.
Other people I've heard like reading the first line in the Enchiridion, kind of like a serenity prayer. That Enchiridion, number 1, that there are things in life you can control and other things you can't.
Absolutely. I mean, and a morning routine is kind of critical. I think it gets your day started right. You read, you have something that you're going to read, whether it be the Enchiridion or something else. Could be something from Meditations, and I think that really kind of gets the process started, and then you go from there. You just have a moment of breath where you feel like you can take on the day. And then you start to go through some of the implementation techniques that he gave us in the chapter, to question throughout the day is like, what would be the consequences if I react in a certain way? Then how, what would be the difference if I acted rationally in this particular situation? These are key questions that we should always be asking ourselves. And then we can, we have the model on top of it. It's a really comprehensive approach on how to change our behavior. And some of the things that they also talked about is the ideas of value clarification. And I found that to be really interesting, and how that was something that actually is used in modern psychology to combat depression. So the Stoics intuitively knew what science is now proving.
I also like how the chapter covers the history. Donald's good about including the history behind these things. And
Yes.
He talked about how Galen, among the other Stoics at the time, that they read. What did they read for their inspiration? It was the golden verses of Pythagoras. Now,
right.
These golden verses are not covered enough in the modern Stoicism movement. I think we should cover them more, because when you read through, and by the way, you can Google this, the golden verses of Pythagoras. It's in Wikipedia and other places. There are 71 of them, I believe, and some of them,
That's
when
correct.
you read through, you pick out right away, wow, that's very Stoic, that's very Stoic.
Yeah, no, I actually ended up doing my own research on the golden verses. And I think that is something that is worthy of a topic in the future. But it's interesting to see that, the Stoics knew there was a recommendation of reading it once, reading it twice, actually, reading it once silently and reading it out loud. And I found that I tried that today with something else, and it does have an effect. It's interesting. Just a little side note.
Now, as we come to the end of the chapter, Donald talks about self-awareness, and that Socratic word, elenchus. It's a tough one to pronounce, but associated with that, I was thinking, I still had in my mind those golden verses of Pythagoras, and I was thinking about how in those days the Pythagoreans, they valued consistency very much. When we talk about self-awareness, you can think of so many different attributes that you have, but consistency or authenticity today, a similar term, are very important. And the Pythagoreans, they looked up at the stars, They thought how consistent the universe appears to us. How consistent can we be in our lives? You know, just me fixing coffee today, for example. I think about how I make the coffee, put in a little milk, put in some sugar, the exact proportion. Where does that milk come from? Where does that sugar come from? But I'm doing my little part. I'm being consistent to myself. And I know that that's what results in the best coffee for me. How can I be the best person I can be? Maybe by being even more consistent in my behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of philosophers that often feel that that virtue is actually a habit, and that you're essentially, this is something that you practice, you cultivate, and you develop, and it becomes second nature to you, because then you have to be consistent to live in accordance with your values. So that, you know, the habits that we form are critical in order to living a well-lived life, according to the Stoics. And so, you know, having a routine that where you're checking yourself in the middle of the day, you have a morning routine, and you have the evening routine where you're holding yourself accountable. You ask yourself, what did I do badly? What did I do well? And what can I do differently? And if you know that by holding yourself accountable, you will, one, you'll be able to see a trend, maybe where things you can improve on, but it's also in your mental accounting as well, that you're going to have to answer to yourself at the end of the day. And that may cause you to just act a little bit differently. And as Donald mentioned, and I had mentioned earlier, where the goal is incremental change. And that's really hard to accept sometimes, but it's really effective. And you know, just little things that you can, these little changes have dramatic results in certain cases.
I agree with that incremental part. Change is difficult for human beings. You know, we get used to it one way, even if we're doing something wrong, and then we got to try to fix that. We do have to make incremental changes. And oh, and one more thing I wanted to add in before we wrap up is, you know, in personal and business life, these value clarifications that we've been talking about, it's not that discussed much in common parlance, but we do have a term called core values. That kind of started, I think, getting popular in business maybe 10 or 20 years ago. What are our core values? Let's stick to our core values, things like that. Yeah, we need to realize that when we get into a business setting or some other setting where core values come up, you know, like if you're my boss, you may ask me to do something that is not ethical. And where are my core values going? They're out the window because I want this job. So that's a philosophical question right there.
Oh, it's incredible. And it's so important. You see this in organizations that fail all the time. They deviate from the mission, right? And your mission is aligned with your values. So that, you know, we have a, you know, Donald actually gave I thought, what is an excellent framework for an individual to outline their values. You know, what do you desire, and what is praiseworthy? And it really makes you think about, what are you really valuing in life, and how are you going to get there? And many times in projects and in companies, I've seen people deviate from those core values, and they act it's to their own peril. And sometimes they don't even identify them, and it fails. So right from the get-go. I think the values clarification part of this chapter is far and away the most important, because once you're able to clarify your values, you can start to take the steps that you need to live the life that you want. And a lot of people don't think about these things, unfortunately. We're not taught in school. Society certainly doesn't teach us. They teach us to go for whatever our desires are in the present moment, to act on our desires. So, but if we're thinking what makes a good life, you have to answer these questions. And the Stoics provide us with a lot of clarification. But I think that is, I thought that was the most critical part of this chapter, because I've seen it both in the business and organizational world, And I've also seen it in our personal lives that sometimes we're just going through life mindlessly and we're not necessarily, we don't have a philosophy of life. You have to have a philosophy of life if you answer those two questions. So I thought that was really important.
That's a good summary. I like it. Yeah, personal lives, business lives, we need to clarify our values, realize maybe how they're slipping away. Hey, there was a song about that, Slip Sliding Away by Paul Simon. We may have, we may have to ask him about that one time, but yeah, so this has been chapter 3 of the book. We've added other material. Next time, we'll start chapter 4 in the book by Donald Robertson, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor.
Subscribe to this channel to hear about new videos. Follow us on social media for more info. Visit StoicDan.com.